Imagine waking up inside a steel city that weighs 100,000 tons, surrounded by 4 million square miles of open ocean, with no roads in, no roads out, no ambulance that can reach you, no hospital within 1,000 miles, and 5,000 people depending on the same 12-person medical staff to keep them alive. That is not a hypothetical. That is Tuesday morning on a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier operating in the Western Pacific, and the moment someone collapses on the flight deck with a cardiac event, or a sailor loses 3 fingers to a machinery accident in the engine room 6 decks below the waterline, or an aviator returns from a mission with internal bleeding and a broken jaw. The entire logic of modern emergency medicine, the logic that says you call 911 and an ambulance arrives in 8 minutes, collapses completely. There is no 911, there is no ambulance, there is no transfer to a level 1 trauma center. There is only what is already aboard, what was planned for before the ship left port, and what the medical team can improvise, execute, and sustain under pressure in a moving steel environment with whatever supplies remain in the onboard pharmacy and whatever blood is available from the walking blood bank that has been quietly maintained among the crew for months. The question is not whether the ship can handle emergencies. The question is how an isolated, self-contained, blackout-capable floating city engineers a complete medical ecosystem from scratch, trains 5,000 people to function inside it, and sustains clinical capability for deployments that can stretch across 6, 7, or 8 months without a single resupply of critical medications or surgical equipment, and what happens to all of it when the pressure peaks, the supplies run low, and the next case walks through the hatch at 0300 in the middle of the South China Sea. The first thing to understand is that the medical department on a carrier is not a sick bay in the traditional naval sense. It is not a room with cots and aspirin. A fully operational carrier medical department runs between 50 and 65 personnel, including general medical officers, a flight surgeon, a dental officer, independent duty corpsmen, surgical technicians, and a rotating cast of specialists that can include orthopedic surgeons, anesthesiologists, and critical care nurses depending on the deployment profile. The facility itself, called the medical department, not the infirmary, because the distinction is operationally important, contains operating rooms with full general surgery capability, a radiology suite with digital X-ray and limited CT imaging, an intensive care unit with ventilator support, a pharmacy stocked with thousands of medications, a blood bank maintained through a living donor pool called the Walking Blood Bank, a dental clinic, an optometry suite, and a morgue. If you have never heard the word morgue in a description of a naval vessel, that tells you something important about how seriously this system takes the permanence of isolation. The morgue is not an afterthought. It is a design requirement. Because in an environment where a helicopter medevac to a land-based hospital can take 4 to 6 hours in optimal conditions, and where sea states can ground all flight operations for days at a time, there will be deaths, and there must be a plan for what happens to the body, to the crew's morale, and to the operational tempo of 5,000 people who watch someone they knew not come back from the medical department. Here is what most people never consider. The medical challenge on a carrier is not only clinical, it is logistical in a way that has no civilian analog. When a hospital on land runs low on O-negative blood, they call the blood bank network. When a carrier runs low on O-negative blood, they call whoever aboard has that blood type and ask them to donate. The walking blood bank is one of the most quietly extraordinary systems operating on a deployed carrier, and it works precisely because it was built into the crew structure from the moment of deployment. Before the ship leaves port, every sailor is blood typed. The types are logged. The distribution across 5,000 people is calculated. High demand types, O negative, AB positive, are identified, and donors in those pools are approached, counseled on what wartime blood donation involves, and enrolled in a standing agreement to donate on request. When a surgical emergency requires 4 units of O-negative blood and the medical department's refrigerated supply has been drawn down by 3 previous cases, the corpsman walks to the berthing area, wakes someone up, explains the situation, and within 45 minutes, That person is on a table donating whole blood that will go directly into a traumatically injured crewmate. There is no crosstown drive. There is no processing delay from an external blood center. The blood is already on the ship, walking around, eating in the mess hall, standing watch on the flight deck, 3 decks above the operating room. And this is where the pressure begins to build in ways that civilian medicine never has to account for, because the walking blood bank operates on the principle of voluntary participation under operational stress. And voluntary participation under operational stress is a system with a psychological margin that narrows over time. In the first weeks of a deployment, donation rates are high, morale is manageable, and the system functions as designed. At month 5, month 6, or month 7, when the crew is exhausted, when berthing is tight, when flight operations have been running 18-hour cycles, when people have not seen land in 90 days, the social and psychological architecture that makes the walking blood bank function starts to strain at the edges. This is not speculation. It is a documented behavioral pattern, and it is one of the reasons the medical department runs a continuous low-grade morale monitoring operation that most of the crew is not consciously aware of. The flight surgeon, embedded with the air wing, is not only watching for fatigue indicators in aviators. The independent duty corpsmen embedded in the ship's divisions are not only treating lacerations and administering medications, they are watching, they are listening. They are feeding information back to the medical officer about the psychological state of the population, because on a ship where 5,000 people share the same recycled air, the same recycled water, and the same 100,000 square meters of steel hull, a psychological fracture in one section of the crew does not stay in that section. Now add to this the specific medical challenge of aviation, because no description of carrier medicine is complete without accounting for the unique physiological violence that naval aviation inflicts on the human body. Every aviator who launches from a carrier catapult experiences a 0 to 165 mile per hour acceleration in approximately 2 seconds, generating forces of 3 to 4 G. Every arrested landing, the wire catch that stops an aircraft from 150 miles per hour to 0 in roughly 320 feet, generates a deceleration event that the human spine was not designed to absorb repeatedly across a 20-year career. The flight surgeon is not simply a physician who happens to be stationed on a ship. The flight surgeon is a specialist in the biomechanics of aviation stress, responsible for monitoring cumulative spinal loading in aviators over deployment cycles, tracking the onset of G-induced loss of consciousness, screening for hypoxia-related cognitive changes, and making the operational call, the call that directly affects the combat effectiveness of the air wing, about whether a pilot who has complained of back pain for 3 days is fit to fly tomorrow's strike package. If you lived inside this system, you would understand quickly that the flight surgeon's office is one of the most politically and operationally sensitive spaces on the ship, because the flight surgeon holds the authority to ground a pilot, and a grounded pilot means a missing aircraft in a strike formation. And a missing aircraft in a strike formation has consequences that cascade upward through the entire operational planning structure. The medical decision and the military decision are not separate here. They are the same decision, made by the same person, under the same pressure, every day. But this creates a new vulnerability that the system has to continuously manage, which is the pressure on the flight surgeon not to ground pilots who should be grounded. This is not a theoretical concern, it is a structural tension built into the role, and the Navy's response to it is architectural. The flight surgeon reports not to the air wing commander whose pilots they are responsible for, but to the ship's medical officer, who reports to the captain, creating a chain of command that is designed, imperfectly but deliberately, to insulate the clinical judgment from the operational pressure. Whether that insulation holds under real conditions, across a 7-month deployment, in a strike group operating under communication restrictions, is a question that the medical department lives with every day. The surgical capability aboard is real, but it operates within constraints that define every decision made inside those operating rooms. The ship carries enough surgical supplies for a defined number of major procedures. The exact inventory varies by deployment and is classified. And once those supplies are consumed, the math becomes brutal. A general surgeon performing an emergency appendectomy uses suture material, anesthesia agents, surgical drapes, sterile gloves, and dozens of disposable instruments that on land would be restocked from a hospital supply chain the next morning. On a carrier in the middle of the Philippine Sea, what is used is gone, and what is gone reduces the margin for every subsequent emergency. The medical officer maintains a running inventory, tracks consumption against projected need based on crew size and historical casualty rates, and makes quiet. You make continuous decisions about which procedures to perform definitively and which to stabilize and transfer based not only on clinical presentation, but on supply math. If you were a patient in that operating room, and you understood that the decision about your care was being shaped partly by a spreadsheet showing how many units of surgical staples remained in the supply locker, it would feel wrong. But it is not wrong. It is the only rational way to manage a finite medical system serving a population that cannot be resupplied on demand, and the surgeons aboard know it, accept it, and build it into their clinical reasoning the way a civilian surgeon builds insurance approval into theirs. The medevac question is where the entire system reaches its highest tension, because medevac, the evacuation of a patient who cannot be stabilized aboard, is not simply a medical decision. It is an operational, meteorological, diplomatic, and sometimes classified decision that can involve the strike group commander, the theater combatant commander, the Joint Personnel Recovery Center, and in some scenarios, the National Command Authority. A patient who needs a level of care that the ship cannot provide, a traumatic brain injury requiring neurosurgical intervention, a burn case exceeding 40% body surface area, a pediatric emergency in the unlikely event a dependent is aboard during a humanitarian mission, creates a cascade of decisions that the medical officer initiates but does not control. The ship's position may not be broadcastable. The helicopter range may not reach the nearest land-based facility without refueling stops that eat hours the patient may not have. The sea state may prevent flight deck operations entirely, grounding all rotary wing assets while a patient deteriorates in the ICU below. And if all of those conditions converge, classified position, sea state above helicopter operating limits, nearest suitable medical facility 8 hours away, then the ship's medical team is not a way station to definitive care. It is the definitive care whether or not it has the resources to fill that role, and the team knows it, and the team trains for it, and the team still loses patients that a land-based trauma center would have saved. The pharmacy is a system that most analyses overlook entirely, and it is one of the most precisely engineered components of the medical department's isolation capability. The carrier pharmacy is stocked at departure through a detailed demand modeling process that takes into account the crew's pre-deployment health screening data, historical utilization rates from previous deployments of similar length in theater, the expected disease burden for the operating environment. Tropical medicine requirements are entirely different from Arctic deployment requirements, and a strategic reserve buffer calculated to maintain 30 days of critical medication supply beyond the projected end of deployment. The pharmacist manages this inventory with the same precision that the ship's supply department manages aviation fuel, because the consequences of running out are similar. Operations stop. A ship where the hypertension medications run out in month 5, where the antidepressants run low in month 6, where the antibiotic inventory cannot sustain a norovirus outbreak that sweeps through the enlisted berthing spaces, is not simply an inconvenient ship. It is a medically compromised ship, and a medically compromised ship is an operationally limited ship, and an operationally limited ship in a contested maritime environment is a liability. The mental health component of this system is the one that the carrier's engineering logic took the longest to integrate, and the one that still carries the most structural tension. For most of naval history, mental health on a deployed ship was managed the same way structural steel fatigue was managed. You waited for visible failure, then addressed it. The transition to proactive psychological support, embedding a psychologist in the medical department, running stress inoculation programs, training division officers to recognize the early indicators of psychological decompensation, happened slowly, unevenly, and against significant institutional resistance. But on a ship where 5,000 people cannot leave, where the same interpersonal conflicts repeat in the same 47 square feet of shared berthing space for 7 months, where the operational tempo does not pause for grief or anxiety or the accumulated weight of isolation, the cost of ignoring psychological health is not abstract. It shows up in the medical department as conversion disorder, as psychosomatic complaints, as the sailor who cannot stand watch anymore but cannot articulate why, and as the rare but devastating event where a crew member's psychological collapse crosses into violence or self-harm in an environment where there is nowhere to run and no one outside to call. The psychological support system that now operates on carriers is thin, overworked, and chronically understaffed by civilian mental health standards. But it is present, and its presence represents a design philosophy that has gradually accepted that the human beings running this machine are as much a system as the catapults and the reactors, and that they require the same kind of proactive engineering attention. Underneath all of it, underneath the surgical suite, and the pharmacy, and the walking blood bank, and the flight surgeon's office, and the psychological support structure, runs the power system that makes everything else possible. And it runs on 2 naval nuclear reactors that do not stop, that cannot be allowed to stop, that generate enough electricity to power a mid-sized American city, and that keep the lights on in the operating room, regardless of what is happening on the flight deck or in the surrounding ocean. The operating room does not lose power during a combat event. The ICU does not go dark during a storm. The pharmacy's refrigeration units do not fail when the ship is running silent with all electronic emissions suppressed. This is not accidental. The medical department is on a separate electrical distribution circuit that includes emergency backup power sufficient to sustain clinical operations for hours in the event of catastrophic main power failure. And the maintenance of that circuit is as critical to the medical mission as the training of the surgeons who work inside it. If you were a patient in that ICU and the ship took damage that severed the main power distribution, you would not know it. The monitors would flicker for approximately 1.2 seconds, the backup system would engage, and the room would continue as before, because the engineering team that designed this ship decided decades ago that the margin for error inside a medical space is 0, and they built accordingly. What has never been fully solved, what remains the open question at the center of all of this engineering, is the problem of specialized care that general surgery cannot provide. The carrier can perform an appendectomy. It can manage a fracture. It can resuscitate a drowning. It can stabilize a burn. What it cannot do is provide the care that requires subspecialty capability that cannot be sustained aboard at scale. The neurosurgeon for the intracranial bleed, the cardiothoracic surgeon for the penetrating chest trauma that crosses the aorta, the burn surgeon for the mass casualty event on the flight deck. These are the cases that require medevac, and medevac requires conditions, weather, position disclosure, asset availability, that may not exist when the patient needs them. The system engineers around this gap through aggressive triage, through stabilization protocols that buy hours rather than solve problems, through prepositioning of hospital ships within strike group range when operational tempo allows, and through the quiet acceptance that in a system designed to operate without the modern world, there are limits that the modern world's best engineering has not overcome. The question that remains, after all the planning and all the training and all the system design, is the same question that faces every isolated medical system in human history. What do you do when the next case is the one your system was not built to handle, and the next helicopter cannot fly, and the ocean offers nothing in return?